We were hearing stories of people have landed up in other countries and like lost their job the moment they landed. So it was like nerve wracking. What you're able to do is if there are good ideas that need to be explored or could be explored, you're the one making sure that those good ideas see the light of day. I think one of the things that people don't realize is you have to not only talk about successes but also talk about your failures, right? Like
Yeah,
admitting that you failed
yeah,
at something is
right.
not a bad thing as long as you
Yeah.
can talk about the learning that you have had from it, right?
Hey everyone, I'm your host Serin. Today we have Azad, a product manager at Spotify on our show. He is specifically looking into the Spotify search. Azad goes above and beyond to help PMs in the community. I'm super happy to share the stage with him and take a lot of thoughts from him today. Looking forward to the conversation, Azad, and once again, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So Azad, tell me about your journey to becoming a PM.
Yeah. Hey, Sarin, thanks for having me. And yeah, for as for the journey of me becoming a PM, so it began while I was studying computer science and education. I sort of did my formal education at NIT Warangal, where I quickly realized that hey, I'm never sort of going to be a top coder. There were like brilliant people around me, and like sort of my passion was more around like sort of like talking to people, making sure that the right things are getting done. And I was very sort of social as a person. And yeah, I sort of ended up looking for jobs that aligned. Like I was very clear in my first sort of while looking for placements during the time that, hey, I can't like, don't want to go into like a coding profile and then eventually transfer over. So I got my first job as sort of business analyst or project manager at a company called Capital IQ. It sort of is a fintech company, and
Mhm.
but the role that I was doing there, luckily, was a role that sort of aligned to what a PM or an APM does in their early days, which is essentially doing market research, talking to a lot of customers, and figuring out. And it was for an internal tool, so everything was very seamless because we had a limited set of people you could talk to. So
Yeah.
doing all of that gave me a taste of what like a APM does. At that time, product management hadn't like sort of picked up as such in India,
Yeah.
so I was still doing this job, being
So you didn't know
like
like
yeah,
there was something like
yeah,
APM at that point of time, right?
no, nothing,
Okay.
zero
Okay.
idea of what product managers like. I don't know by coincidence or like whatever you want to call it, but like we had product managers in the company, but they were all based in the US. And I like
Hmm.
even in that company, they had never thought of like having a PM in India. So
So
because they
you
were
were
all like
never
customer
face to
facing,
face
yeah,
with a PM at that
no,
point. Okay,
never.
awesome.
Like all my tools were like in the back end, so like never talked to anyone who was actually
Mhm.
working with like customers. Who our customers are like investment bankers and like big decision makers in the money world. So like their conversations don't really need to touch the work that I was doing. It was more
Yeah.
like internal, and yeah, it was a lot of like coordination, product project management as well on like how to when to get stuff built. But luckily, what happened is during that time I realized
Mhm.
that a lot of the work that I'm doing, I was able to preempt the needs of the users, right? I was able to surface up
Mhm.
that, hey, this internal tool, this work that we're doing here, it doesn't really sort of provide value. There's other things that we can do through my conversations with these people. Luckily, they were in the same building. Um,
Mhm.
so I was able to sort of get some insights. And then eventually, when talking to my manager, and then he pointed out that, hey, do you know there are like
Oh,
these PM roles that exist, and like
okay.
would you be interested, because we are shifting to agile as a
Okay.
sort of methodology, so would you want to become like an APM slash PO role and like sort of continue working on this product, but like
Which
shift
was
your
this
lens a
company?
little bit.
What was the company? Like the first
uh,
company of yours?
yeah, it's called Capital IQ. It was
Capitalize. Okay.
yeah, Capital IQ, and like nowadays you can find it as S&P Global,
Okay.
and like the division that it sort of belongs to now is called Market Intelligence.
Okay.
So yeah,
Mhm.
that's how it was structured or is structured today, and
Uh-huh.
yeah. Mhm.
And like the trigger point was your manager, right? Like who pointed you to this career.
Yeah, a combination, right? Like I talked to him about,
Okay.
hey, I want to do like this sort of stuff, and so usually the way I looked at it was there was this strategic decisions that were coming down from management saying this is what you have to do, right? And then
Mm.
I was sort of saying like it was not my role, but I was sort of pushing my perspective to it that yes, this is like aligned to what we want to do, but maybe this is something that we don't want to do right now. From a more project management lens, that hey, let's push back the delivery of this. And then eventually in conversations with my manager, I wanted to grow and wanted to understand like how are these
Mm.
strategic decisions being made, right? Like what are we even considering? And like he was like, yeah, you're doing some of it by telling us the right way to execute and things, but there is a larger sort of lens at play here where you have to talk to a lot more stakeholders and like look at it from more of a 10,000 feet level to come up with these strategies. But there
Mm.
is a role that we're looking at bringing into this team where this person would actually coordinate not just with internal stakeholders but external stakeholders as well, and sort of try to come up with like sort of preempting the needs of the users and building the tool out for it. And we were also getting into like at that time very rudimentary machine learning sort of machine learning based data extraction, which was very new at the time. I was very lucky to be part of it. So
Yeah.
that sort of prompted, hey, let's do this from like more of a product owner role and build out a internal product for it.
So if I understand it rightly, you were exploring for
Hmm.
other kind of opportunity which was aligned to your interest areas.
Yeah.
Actually,
Hmm.
your manager also pointed you to this direction that hey, let's go to
Yes.
something like a PM. Okay,
Hmm.
awesome,
Yeah.
awesome. Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Then how it happened? Like, so within the
Hmm.
current like that company which you were working in,
Hmm.
you got into PM. Like, what was the
Yeah.
story? Tell me.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a sort of interesting thing, right? Like
Yeah.
because of the transition into agile,
Uh huh.
we sort of became it. So there was a need for like a scrum master that I used to be earlier, but then also like a PO sort of role, and that's where I
Mm.
sort of transitioned into not just like making the team a little bit more agile and like following those rules, but also playing the
Yeah.
role of talking to other product owners across other teams that had like a dependency on us, and then figuring out okay, what are the actual like, so at that time it was more around like coming up with good user stories for the team as well, that
Mm.
hey, what do we actually need to do? And like I think there were two ways of doing it at the time because there was no prescription, so you could have either written, nowadays what we do is like write a product
Yeah.
requirements document and stuff. I think that's what we didn't do, but we directly jumped into like, hey, okay, let's define what the user stories are, break the sort of requirements
Yeah.
down, and then drive the discussion in that way and make sure that we are able to come up with again a new term for me at that time, an MVP product, so that we
Yeah.
are able to get it out, right?
Yeah.
All this stuff was like on the fly discovery of like how do we like, it was all sort of need based, where I was like, hey, we need to speed up execution, we need to come up with new things, and like there were a lot of people doing this along with me. So yeah, we transitioned into okay, discovering all these things and like getting directions on how do we build quicker and like experiment faster. And that's how I landed into like this PO role, and then eventually when like things
PO
shaped
role.
up,
Yeah.
yeah, from the PO role, then things shaped up into okay, you want to. I grew there a little bit, and um, then eventually again like a
Mm.
formal, if you want to call it like a proper title position, sort of from a front end facing product role, which a lot of
Yeah.
people nowadays consider is like product management at its
Yeah.
from a job responsibilities perspective. Maybe that is when I came into search, which is my current passion as well.
Yeah.
Again, similar thing, right? I was just like, there's a role opening up for a product manager in India, and they were like, okay, we need someone who's like who's worked in like machine learning stuff, but
Yeah.
hasn't like doesn't need to have like a lot of knowledge around it. Um, and they were willing to experiment and like take a chance on someone and say that we'll teach you like the basics of what
Yeah.
search is, but we need you to be sort of forward thinking and like adapt pretty
Yeah.
fast, because this world is like the projects that they're working on are pretty quick evolving, so we need that sort of mentality. And that's what I was able to sort of, I had done a lot of and all this is like 4 or 5 years, right? So I'd done a lot of projects
So
and side
tell me, like,
projects.
which was
Yeah.
that first year, and like, how much year did you take to go to PO and then to
Yes.
PM?
So that's what it was
Mm.
like, about 4 to 5 years of like being from like transitioning from like a business analyst for the first 2 years,
Yeah.
then sort of being this PO APM sort of doing this role for 3 to 4 more years. And during
Yeah.
that time, it was like not just working with the current team that I was working with, but also I got an opportunity to be part of a lot of side projects that the company
Okay.
was doing, which
Hmm.
involved stuff even like blockchain, right? Which at that time was just an
Ah,
emerging technology, and
right.
luckily there were
And
like
all these
divisions,
things,
yeah,
side projects also you were doing within the company, right? So you were
within the
looking for,
company. Yeah, yeah,
oh,
yeah.
nice.
So
Yeah, yeah,
I made sure that I had like sort of being in the role of like a PO where or a APM, whatever you want to call it from a title perspective, like you could sort of stay in touch with a lot of other developments and like priorities that were coming up in the company. And like this
yeah.
blockchain opportunity that was up for grabs as a project where they were just looking for people, again, same skill set, right? Like hungry to learn, worked in something which is
Hmm.
ambiguous, can help the team get direction and
Yeah,
execute fast. So yeah, got an opportunity to sort of
yeah.
be part of that team for a while, and it was like sort of nowadays I think even in Spotify we call it as embedding. So I embedded in another team, which means I didn't do my regular team responsibilities, but I became part of another team for like 3 months where I
Right.
worked on something completely new.
Hmm.
And then like
So
yeah, those
how
all
long
things.
was this whole tenure?
Uh,
Like the whole tenure with the first company?
it was 7 years, right? So
7 years.
like
That was
yes,
long.
yeah, that is
That's
long. And then the last two of them, which I was sort of transitioning into, was like the search world, where
ah.
I got
So
became part
you
of the
had
search
your
team.
beginnings
Mhm.
in search with the same
With
company
this
itself, and
company.
then
Yes, the first
oh,
company.
okay, okay.
Yeah.
And then what happened? Like after the first company, so you became a business
Hmm.
analyst to a PO, and from
Hmm.
there you transitioned to PM, right?
Hmm.
What happened
Yeah.
after that? Like how did the story evolve?
Yes. After that, I was like, I had worked in a company for very long, right? Like 7 years,
Yeah,
7 to 8 years it takes a
yeah,
toll, and like you want to sort of, with the mentality that I had of always like trying something new.
right.
I was like, okay, maybe it's time to like sort of shift gears, and like at that time, the startup scene in India was like, or like for a while, the startup scene was like booming, and I
Yeah.
felt like I was missing out. So I was like, okay, let's sort of transition. And luckily, I had a few friends who had shifted
Sorry
to,
to
yeah,
interrupt you, but like
yeah.
this SMP company, like what
Mhm.
stage of a company is it? Like, is it a growth
It's a
stage company, corporate,
huge
corporate?
sort of, sorry, yeah, it's
Yeah,
super corporate MNC, US headquartered. It has offices everywhere, but like it's been a legacy company, right? It's been around for like 150, 160 years. So like,
oh wow, wow.
it's been operating in, yeah, it's been operating for quite
Mhm.
some time
Mhm.
now, pretty
Mhm.
established.
Sorry to cut you, but
Mhm.
back to the
Yeah.
story.
Yes. No,
Yeah,
not an issue. So I think so. Yeah, shifting gears, right? Like I had
yeah.
a few friends who had joined startups and have said that hey, the pace of learning, the learning curve is pretty steep, and like it's nice, you'll enjoy it. This is something that seems like up to speed with what you want to do. So luckily, I had a friend who had just sort of joined a startup, was finding it very nice from a culture and work perspective. She referred me, and I ended up at a company called Gainsight.
Mhm.
Which is a play on the words gain insight. So gain sight.
Gain, gain side.
And then essentially, I hope that is the case. Sorry if I'm not doing it right. But yeah, essentially, that company deals in the customer success management space,
Okay.
which essentially is sort of, if you have not heard about what CSM is, please do check it out. But
Hmm.
it's sort of a B2B SaaS company for like from a terminology perspective. And
Got it.
what they do is like if you have a SaaS product which requires a company to sort of onboard and make sure that your clients sort of stick to your SaaS product, then you hire CSMs in general. In general, you do have CSMs or account managers, and they sort of take the burden of making sure that your product is successful and sort of liaising with the product teams to build out your product and like make sure that you're not losing any customers. So we built a platform specifically for that workflow,
Mm.
and I was part of in that startup. I was part of the analytics domain.
Okay.
Something which in general a lot of companies want to build very integrated into their platform. So
Yeah.
there are two routes: you either build and buy and integrate, or you sort of build something ground up. So
Yeah.
yeah, this company had chosen to go the ground up way and had built something completely from scratch in their platform
Mhm.
for analytics. And they were looking for someone to come and sort of make the product even more likable,
So
and did
how did
that
you
forward. Yeah.
see that this was aligned to your aspirations? Like, was there any criteria
Great
which you thought?
question.
Yeah.
How did so it was aligned from a few perspectives, right? I think one,
Yeah.
it was a domain change from like
Mm.
fintech to customer success. Second, it was a startup, so I wanted to sort of
Ah,
make
okay.
sure that that pace is something that is sort of exciting. And then I had, in my current role as a sort of PM in search at S&P, I had been using Tableau and sort of Power BI for a while, and I had built some dashboards and like workflows on it. So it was very
Mm.
exciting to me from that perspective. So when I gave the interview at Gainsight, that was, that was a topic of conversation as well, on like
Yeah.
how huge and massive those tools are, and like
Yeah.
the potential of having something more leaner and integrated in a platform and what it could do. So yeah, that's sort of the thing that
Mm.
got aligned for me from
Yeah.
all these sort of perspectives.
Understood. Understood.
Mhm.
And what happened after that? Like you joined that company and
Yeah.
then
So yeah, I worked there for about a year and a half, and during that time, I think we had a lot of fun. I was
Mhm.
able to sort of
So you were
live the
enjoying the
dream.
startup
Yeah,
culture as
yeah, I
expected.
was enjoying the startup culture. I think it sort of jived with me. I had an amazing manager again,
Awesome.
and then I think I was able to sort of understand, like talking to customers, like figuring out
Yeah.
fast-paced prioritization. And I think one of the things that I still remember to this day is the fact that, like, when I came in, I had like, you never sort of think that you're ever going to talk to the CEO of a company on a
Yeah.
regular basis, and like that
Yeah.
company gave me an opportunity to be like, I this never came up in the interviews, but like when I joined, and after a few weeks, they're like, okay, so in 3 weeks we have a presentation to the CEO, and I'm like, what? And they're like, yeah, you're supposed to drive it, and like you have to present the roadmap and this and that, and I'm like, okay, that
You
sounds
were never
like
used to that situation earlier.
yeah.
Yeah.
Presenting to senior leaders is one
Yeah.
thing, but then like presenting to
Yeah.
CEO of a company becomes a whole another ball game,
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Definitely.
yeah, so that was like a thing that happened, and then that was surreal for like a year and a half,
Yeah.
building those products and like working with an amazing team of engineers. But then we like sort of, again, the bug to sort of grow and explore a little bit more, bit, because again, networking with other people and like sort of talking about growth opportunities, it seemed like
Yeah.
Europe is something where people are sort of moving to in my circles, and like saying that, hey, this
Yeah.
is great for work life balance, and like you have a
So
lot of good
one, sorry to
opportunities
cut
here.
you, but
Yeah.
like one question, like the second
Mhm.
company which you were
Mhm.
in, like where was it
Mhm.
located?
It was in Hyderabad only. It was
It
a
was in
startup.
Hyderabad.
Yeah.
Okay,
Uh-huh.
okay, got it, got it. Understood.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Yeah,
never
continue.
shifted cities. I never shifted
Yeah,
cities. Like I was started in Hyderabad, stayed there for like 10 years, seven
yeah,
of which 7.5 were in S&P, and then like 1.5 was in Gainside. And
okay.
then essentially, yeah.
So you were trying to like go cross the borders, right?
Yeah.
Try out something new.
I was like,
Yeah,
let's change the locality as well and do something
yeah,
better. And like, yeah.
yeah,
By that time, I'd gotten married as well, and like me and my wife were sort of thinking, hey, we need to. Even she was like sort of part of a startup as well, so we were just
yeah,
thinking about what it would be like to be in a different environment and like have a little
yeah,
bit more work-life balance. Because, yeah, to be honest, like like working in a startup is, it takes a toll, right? Like you're always
yeah.
on, you're always thinking about what could be done, and like there's always so much that can be done that you never really switch off. And I think
Right.
yeah, I wanted a different pace, to be honest. And one thing that didn't help is the fact that Spotify at that time when I applied had sort of advertised this role of, we want someone in search, and like I
Sorry,
had
Azad,
sort
like
of,
when was
yeah.
this? Like when
Mhm.
were you trying to move to Spotify?
I didn't move to Spotify. Like
Okay.
when like sort of I wasn't trying to
You
move to
were
Spotify directly. I was just
uh,
looking for like roles in Europe. But
exploring.
and like
Okay.
I had a filter on LinkedIn that used to show me jobs, and like generally
Yeah.
Booking has the most amount of openings in like Europe.
Yeah.
So that used to
The
show up
filter
along
was
with,
like
yeah.
Europe. Some
Yeah, filter was Europe, right?
location.
Yeah,
Location was
filter
the
was,
next big criteria.
yeah,
Okay.
location was the biggest criteria that I want to shift to Europe.
Yeah.
And then like, yeah, there were a bunch of companies obviously in other cities like Berlin, which with Delivery Hero and all, that have a good
Yeah.
amount of expats coming in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then Amsterdam has Booking, which again attracts a lot of
Yeah.
expats. So those
yeah.
were the regular ones that were showing up, and like I was going through the interview rounds, which are pretty different from what how it happens in India.
Yeah.
Um, and then yeah, when Spotify showed up and like sort of said that, hey, we're looking for someone in search, and you seem to have the right background. Let's talk.
Oh, okay.
Like basically I applied and
So
sort of
your
said that
search
I have like,
background is what aligned with
"Mhm.
Spotify immediately.
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
Hmm.
yes," and that's what worked, right?
Hmm.
And essentially, when we talked with the recruiting manager, recruiting, yeah, I'm forgetting what the exact term is, but recruiting partner, and then the
Yeah.
hiring manager, it sort of seemed like a good fit for me to go ahead and like talk to the rest of the team and
Mhm.
figure out if I'm
So
a good
you
fit.
had like an initial conversation with them and you saw the opportunity on LinkedIn,
Yes, yeah,
and they kind of like onboarded you saying that, hey, like it's like you seems like aligned to the
yes,
role, and then you guys had a discussion. Hmm.
yes.
When was this? Like when was this happening?
This happened end of 2020, no, sorry, not end, the in September of 2022.
September of 2022. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So while the whole recession and everything was like just kicking off, right? Like you
Yes,
were
yes.
okay,
So I
okay,
remember it was a even doubly more difficult decision because
yeah,
a lot of companies had just started sort of saying that, hey,
yeah,
we might be sort of laying off people. And I think
yeah,
at that time, even there was like this entire website that was showing how many companies have laid off how many people.
yeah,
So it was sort of nerve wracking that do you really want to leave like a job
yeah,
here in India and like change your country? And like we were hearing stories of people have landed up in other countries and like, left, lost their job the moment they landed. So it was like nerve wracking to a point where when maybe that's a story for eventually in the conversation. But yeah, it
yeah.
was pretty difficult to sort of go through that
Awesome,
entire process.
awesome, awesome.
Hmm.
Cool, yeah. Nice to hear that entire journey, man. So
Hmm.
the way you came from, let's say, BA to like pure role, and then like you spent like that 7 years there to
Hmm.
come to Spotify recently. Like amazing journey, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's switch gears
Hmm.
into, let's say, talk a little bit about. So you have been into product management for a while now, right? Like
Hmm.
I think more than couple of years now, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Tell me, like, what is product management according to you, right? Like, what is your thought process, right? Like, in very simple terms,
Yeah.
like if you put it like a capsule, like what is actually product management for you? Yeah,
Yeah, I think I would want to quote someone who I recently heard on LinkedIn, and like that sort of resonated with me more than
yeah,
anything else that I've read in like these 6, 7 years.
yeah,
Um, it's that like as a product manager, you are a force multiplier within the org, which just
yeah,
means that like ideally, and to just to elaborate on this a little bit, right? Like it captures the essence of quite a lot of things, but like one thing that it really hits home is like you're not an engineer, you're not a designer, and
yeah.
you're definitely not someone who's like doing the groundwork of like building something from scratch. But
True.
at the same time, what you're able to do is if there are good ideas that need to be explored or could be explored, you're the one making sure that those good ideas see the light of day and are able to be sort of built by the company, are brought in front of the right stakeholders, are presented in the right way, presented at the right time so that they
Yeah,
get they get the success that
yeah,
they deserve. And you're just like that sort of middle person making sure that all these pieces that need to fit together to make a great product
yeah,
actually happen.
yeah.
So that's
Yeah,
product
yeah.
management for me.
I think that's an amazing definition because a lot of people have very, very different
Mhm.
expectation about
Yeah.
like the whole product management job, and I think that perfectly explains like, hey,
Mhm.
what it is in reality, right?
Yeah.
Rather than like, let's say, very sugar coated terms and stuff like that, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, amazing. Um, so like, since you told about that, right? Like, what do you think are the top traits of a great product manager? Like in your perception, like you have been in the industry for a while, like
Mhm.
what, like you would have observed so few great
Yeah.
product leaders as well, right? So
Yes.
like any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think some of the if I had to like call out one very important trait, especially like on in the context of what I've just said as being a force
Yeah,
multiplier, it's to be a great storyteller, right?
yeah,
Like I think
true.
a lot of the times, you're sort of involved in meetings and like you're writing docs and presenting your ideas. And at the core of any of that activity that you're doing is that you're telling a story, right? And like depending on the audience, how you tailor that story, and how you sort of bend and morph it to fit the sort of needs of the audience that you're addressing, really, really changes the game for between like what a good PM can do and like what a great PM does. I've
Yeah,
seen that make a world of difference. And then I think
yeah,
the other sort of trait that I feel like differentiates or like sort of is different from most other roles is like you really need to have good clarity of thought, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
which means that you can't just be reactionary and like sort of go behind every thing that just occurs to you. You have to sort of whatever comes in your way, like because in product management, a lot of times you have so many stakeholders pushing so many ideas on you that
yeah,
the best or like the easiest thing is to be reactionary and say no, yes, whatever, and deal with stuff. But the ability to just gather your thoughts, sit down, have a sort of way to detangle everything, to cut through the noise, and like get provide clarity not only to yourself but to everyone around you becomes
yeah.
a very important trait in product management, at least according to me.
Yeah, yeah. I think as product manager, we are
Mhm.
constantly thrown at from all sides, right?
Yeah.
I
Yes.
think that visual is what came to my mind, like when you told
Yes.
it. I think that's very true.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I want to ask you this question, right? Like this is one of my favorite questions, right? Like how do you improve yourself, right? Daily.
Mm-hmm.
As a PM, right? Like a lot of people see it differently. Maybe I've seen like some people think about it as, hey, I don't just improve myself as a PM, but like when
Mm-hmm.
I learn certain things, I actually like improve myself as a complete person, right? Like what
Yes.
is your formula for that, right? And how do you do that personally?
To be honest, like I used to be in the previous camp, or like the camp that believed that, hey, you have to just learn product management every day or like improve yourself in your domain
Yeah,
every day to be a great PM. But
yeah,
over time, I've seen that shift because of being able to observe other PMs and like
yeah,
how they're good at different things.
yeah.
Yeah, for me, it's a combination of a few things, right? I feel like listening to the other product leaders, especially through podcasts like Lenny's podcast,
Mm,
um, has been like an amazing
yeah,
source because even if you notice what he does in his note podcast is he's not just calling product leaders, he's
yeah,
calling people from a variety of domains, and that just sort of highlights the difference
yeah,
that you should be able to learn from each and every sort of leader that has accomplished uh, problem. So like not just
yeah,
reading about product, but like going into or like making sure on my LinkedIn feed is sort of diverse with different sorts of product
yeah,
leaders and like
yeah.
reading that. But I also take time to be a little bit more creative. So I'm sort of getting into, I used to do a lot of code editing back in the day and like sort of break away from the noise and just, focus on something completely different.
Yeah,
Try to see, and like, I think when you're doing something completely different and like immersing yourself in that, you sort of
yeah,
discover how are other people solving problems or how have they built
yeah,
something to solve something different. And as a like that's one way I feel like that's an underrated skill for PMs is like go away from what you're doing currently in your domain. I've started doing a lot of gaming as well, and there's so
yeah,
many things and principles that happen in game design and the way that people are onboarded onto games and video games. There are a ton of great educational videos around it, but like as a PM in search, you would never think about looking at video games, right? But
yeah,
there is a ton of things that you can learn from, like how people think about perception, about how data is presented on the screen, and how do you
yeah.
sort of make sure that users are able to, navigate in a complex environment. All of that just gives sort of a small idea of there is no one way to do something, but the best way is to just explore and be as diverse as possible.
So, like, how does it happen? So, you basically,
Mhm.
if I understand it correctly,
Yeah,
you kind of explore wide array of
yeah.
different topics, and
hmm
like certain things which you like, you go deeper into it, right? Like, is that a correct assumption?
yeah, maybe. So I think I don't. I think what you're referring to, sort of in the industry, is called like a T model, right? You like
Yeah.
sort of
Hmm.
explore widely, and then you go deeper on the areas that
Hmm.
you want to.
Yeah.
Uh, But I feel like, yeah, that could be one way of looking at it, that, hey, I'm like very deep in the search domain, but I also want to explore sort of other areas around this thing. But I feel like, yeah, that to me, it's more like I look at it as a graph, that, hey, there
Yeah.
are like points on my sort of in the area that I operate in that I want to be able to join. So that necessarily doesn't mean that I have to like connect one to the other and like
Okay.
join like a T and like go depth.
Yeah.
But it's just like
Yeah.
sort of a network. It's a knowledge graph, right? Build
Yeah.
everything wherever you can, capture data wherever you can, and then eventually,
Yeah.
in my experience, things come back. Right? You're
Yeah.
able to quote certain things from somewhere, or able to draw experience when you need to, but I never sort of, I think maybe to sort of summarize it, right? I never sort of do something with the aim of I want to discover something, or I want to go here. I just do it for the joy of discovering something new. And then eventually, in my experience, I've always been able to connect dots
Yeah.
as and when like time progresses.
So it's more of like rather than a T, it's like different dots, and you keep
Mhm.
connecting and making letters whenever you want to
Yes.
make sense of a particular letter. That's interesting.
Think-
That's interesting.
yeah.
So tell me this, Azad. Like, hey, like, is there any specific topics that you are currently like exploring, like very specifically? You mentioned about the gaming one,
Mhm.
but beyond that, any specific topics you are exploring?
That's an interesting question. I think I've been getting, because of maybe because of Spotify also, but like I've been exploring a little bit more in depth on like the music domain in general,
Hmm.
because that's something that like I had an idea of music in general. Obviously, we all consume it,
Yeah.
but how the industry works, and like how us like how Spotify does music, and like what we want to do in the future, what is like the sort of business decision that goes into it. I'm exploring that a little bit more at
Hmm.
this point of time, and
Interesting.
trying to
Interesting.
understand how everything works,
Interesting.
because it's very complicated.
Yeah. Cool, yeah, awesome.
Hmm.
So let's shift gears once again, right? I
Hmm.
think this is one part I think audience, a lot of people would be looking forward to also.
Hmm.
In terms of like you told your story of hey, like how did you end up uh, landing your job in Spotify and stuff like that,
Hmm.
right? So can you share a bit about like how was the PM interview process there was like, right? Like
Hmm.
if you can share some thoughts on it, I'm sure like it would be helpful for a lot of people who would be thinking to add value to Spotify and move to maybe Europe or some other
Hmm.
countries, right? Like of their
Yeah.
interest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. So I think from tracking the or like interviewing for Spotify, it started off with me reaching out to the sort of recruiting partner and talking about why I'm a good fit, right?
Mhm.
Which
So
mainly
you
involves,
applied to that
yeah,
role or like you actually
yeah,
like
yeah.
what was the process like?
Yeah, I apply. So as I said, right, like earlier in the podcast, I talked about like having a filter on Europe, and
Right.
having sort of a sort of keyword that said anything related to product management, please pop up on
So,
my radar.
no, so I was
Yeah.
asking like, yeah,
Hmm.
I knew that like you kept a filter
Hmm.
and you were
Yeah.
hunting for that.
Yeah.
But did you go and directly apply through LinkedIn or let's say you reached out to the recruiter and then probably like had the
Uh,
conversation?
No. So I actually applied via LinkedIn, but then on
Okay.
LinkedIn there was an option while applying to Spotify that you could sort of attach a cover letter as well. So that was
Ah,
my way of reaching out to the
oh, okay.
recruiter and letting them know that
Mm.
beyond just checking my resume and like looking at how fit I am as a candidate, I wanted
Yeah.
to sort of highlight why I feel that I am a good fit for this role, right? Like sort of
Okay.
tailor my
Yeah.
experience to, hey, this is what you're looking for. This is where I have done work earlier,
Yeah.
and that's where that's the sort of way I have put it as I reached out to
Yeah.
the recruiter.
Yeah.
But in a sense, it was just like basically a cover letter,
Got it.
letting them
Got
know.
it.
Mhm.
Got it. And what happened after that? Like, did they connect with you and like what were
Yes.
the rounds like? If you can share a bit.
Yeah, definitely. So after the application, I think in a few days' time, I heard back from them in an email that, hey, saw that you applied to Spotify. Great to sort of get in touch with you. It would be awesome if we could have a short conversation. We fixed a time for like 30 minutes, where essentially the conversation went like, just tell me about yourself. Where are you based? What are you doing currently? And then like,
Yeah.
why do you think that you want to work at Spotify, right? Like, why
Right.
this role? why Spotify? Like, just give me an overview. So like we
Yeah.
talked about that for like 15 minutes, talking through
Mm-hmm.
the experiences that I've had and like what I've done in my previous companies, very focused on like search, right? Those 2 years that
Mm-hmm.
I built, like what were the challenges and like what did I learn and how did I deal with building out something there. That's basically when she said, awesome, let's just go ahead and like sort of fix up a meeting with the hiring manager for like another 30 minutes just to
Yeah.
have them also included in the process of shortlisting. And then like that was another 30-minute conversation where again just talked about who I am, where
Mm-hmm.
I'm from, what I'm doing currently, and then also focused on a bunch of why search and what interests me about search.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and
This
yeah,
was with the recruiter, right? Like with the
uh,
recruiter.
recruiter and then hiring manager.
Oh, okay. Okay. The hiring
Mhm.
manager also was there. Okay.
Yeah, 30 minutes
Mm.
with the recruiter, and then 30 minutes after, like as soon as the hiring recruiter was done, we scheduled another call with the hiring manager in the next 2 days itself
Got
to
it.
sort of
Got it.
get that
Mm.
conversation started.
Mm-hmm. What
Hmm.
happened after that? Like, so mostly the first
Hmm.
rounds were basically they were trying to check like what is the alignment, right?
Fit. Yeah,
In terms
yeah,
of like, hey, how you would be a fit for that, right? So what was
exactly.
the process after that? Like you had a multiple sets of core rounds or like what happened after that?
Yeah, so I think after that is when we sort of dived into the gen. So now you're like the to anyone who's listening to this podcast, like your particular process might differ because
Mm.
Spotify tends to tailor your interviews based on what the team's needs are. In my
Ah,
particular
okay.
case, my sort of interviews were broken apart into 2 days. One with just two interviews just to get warmed up, and then
Oh,
another day with like six interviews back to back.
wow.
And it's like that's what I think in a lot of the big tech companies you call a loop, right?
Okay.
So the interview loop. So essentially, it was around eight interviews of just talking to your design manager, your engineering managers, your let me start from like
Yeah.
like I don't think it's sort of the order can really differ, but
Mm.
you will definitely have an interview with like your peers. If like
Yeah.
most probably in Spotify you have a bunch of teams that you're working with, so two to three product
Yeah.
managers within your sort of product area.
Yeah.
You will have a tech strategy conversation with someone who's at a director level at product at
Okay.
Spotify.
Yeah.
You will talk to engineering managers, you will talk to design managers if your role sort of necessitates that. And then you will talk to data and insights managers, and then you will talk to data science and like data research as well. um, and essentially it will be leaders in your sort of in the area that you're
Yeah.
being hired in. They will generally come to sort of talk to you about how do you work with, and the general theme as an overarching theme, obviously like depending on what the interview is, they will deep dive on that topic and like sort of try to gauge what your understanding of the domain is. But the
Mm.
overarching theme is just to understand how do you deal with problems, how do you work with people, and how have you sort of thought about I mean in the product side we can get a little bit deeper into it, but with
Yeah.
everyone else it was more about how do you deal with difficult situations, how do you work when you faced with like choices that
Right.
like have no easy answer.
Yeah.
And then
So
yeah,
mostly
in
like
general.
behavioral questions, right? Like where you are
Mostly
judged upon
behavioral
your
questions,
past
yes.
stories, how
Hmm.
you are actually dealt that
Hmm.
situations and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Mm.
but with a twist of was this an insights situation, or how do you work with like inside folks, or was there a
Yeah.
time when like you had to use data to prove a point and stuff like that? So it's
Right.
sort of behavioral, but at the same time there's a lot that depends on what have you done in the past to like push the boundaries of the
Mm.
situations that you have come across, and
Yeah.
then either and it I think one of the things that people don't realize is you have to not only talk about successes but also talk about your failures, right? Like
Yeah.
admitting that you failed
Yeah.
at something is
Right.
not a bad thing as long as
Yeah.
you can talk about the learning that you have had from it, right? Because
Right.
a lot of
Right.
people treat as, hey, I failed in this task, so I never talk about it in an interview. But
Right.
to me it's almost like it's an underrated thing of talk about your failure, talk about the learnings, and highlight
Yeah.
how you have used that learning in another success if possible, right?
Right.
that's
Right.
that's
Makes
so
sense.
much more value.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that's an interesting strategy. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, so I think that is where I want to come to next, right? So
Yeah.
basically, if I summarize your entire interview experience, it was like with the recruiter first, then you have, let's say, recruiter and hiring manager,
Hmm.
then like the loop one which you told, right? Like where there was back to
Hmm.
back 6 rounds where you were having different types of
Yeah.
rounds with your peers, other stakeholders, and stuff like that. It's
Hmm.
like, so what did you do differently, right? Like, how did you prepare for these interviews, right? Because typically when somebody hears like a company
Hmm.
like Spotify, right,
Hmm.
like everybody would think like, hey, like how did this guy really crack this, right? So like what was that like how did you prepare for it, right? Like just want to
Hmm.
understand. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I don't think there's a specific. To be honest, there's no specific way to like crack an interview. At least at
Mhm.
Spotify, I feel because what they're really looking for, and I have come to believe this over like the sort of 8 months that I've been here, is that
Yeah.
like you really need to sort of be the sort of person that is always learning, always pushing, and always trying to do better, and always is sort of has this empathy about there are difficult situations, there are difficult conversations, but they can only be overcome if everyone's working together, right?
Mm.
So I feel like obviously there is one sort of aspect of it, right? Like there has to be this good alignment between what you have
Yeah.
been doing in your domain, and
Yeah.
like that sort of implicitly prepares you if you're making sure that you're doing the best you can in that domain and like figuring out
Yeah.
everything, pushing or like achieving the goals that you have set in that role. That
Yeah.
is one way of preparing implicitly for it, but I
Yeah,
don't
that
feel
I
like,
think that's a
yeah,
very great, I mean, like
yeah,
amazing point, right? Like, 'cause in
yeah,
your case, like your previous experience
hmm,
perfectly aligns with this,
hmm,
and you naturally had a lot of stories to tell, right?
yeah,
Hey, like I've been in these roles, right?
yes.
Beyond that, like, were there any specific things you did, right, specifically to prepare for this Spotify? Let's say you
Uh,
have done any kinds of specific preparations. Would love to know that thoughts.
No, actually, to be honest, right?
Oh,
Like it sounds weird that like why didn't you prepare specifically for Spotify? But like I think
yeah,
you can research this on your own. Like there are questions that you can um, look at what does the interviewer ask, or like what does Spotify look for in product management. But then at the end of the day, like you can't sort of prepare for like
yeah,
a behavioral interview unless you've sort of actually been part of situations and like gone through the trenches and figured out problems and stuff. So I didn't like have a good method of like preparing, but all I can sort of say is like I did I did sort of have the advantage of having gone through a lot of interviews
hmm,
beforehand as well,
okay.
which sort of helped me refine the way that
Hmm.
interviewers want to understand, right? Like I was able to sort of through my failures in other interviews and like some successes, I was able to gauge what's working, what's not, right? So like,
Mhm.
uh,
Yeah.
let me put it in this way, right? The way you introduce yourself, right? It's like some
Mhm.
people are okay if you talk for 10 minutes, some people are not, and they just want like a very brief 2 minute introduction and they want to jump right in. How do you gauge that, right?
Yeah.
How do you sort of when you're talking about a problem or when you're dealing with an interviewer, how do you sort of ask for feedback, or like how do you sort of gauge whether you're going in the right direction without explicitly saying, hey, am I doing the right thing or this is what you wanted, right? One of the most important things was that I was able to sort of understand how do you tailor your answers to make sure that the interviewer remains interested and that you're going in the right direction. But then one of the other sort of important things that I came across while I was doing these interviews and reading about stuff was that it's not only how you give the interview, but also how you end it, right? Which
Mhm.
means like towards the end of the interview, if you are not interviewing your interviewer, right? Like if you don't have
Yeah.
as hard hitting questions for them as they have for you, then it
Yeah.
just shows. And I think this is the best way to summarize is that you're just looking for a job, not the job, right? That's a
Right.
very, very
Yeah.
slight distinction. And they
Yeah.
really want to know, at least in the case of Spotify, they really want to know that you want this job and not just a job that just,
Job.
makes it
Mhm.
so that you're just, moving into a better role or some other role. So I
Mhm.
think just asking those questions and like having the presence of mind to say that you are in this position. What have you dealt with as the or like let me put it this way, right? Like one of my favorite questions to ask or like get asked in an interview. Um, is that like when you have dealt with a difficult situation in your company or like when your team has failed at something, how did you deal with it? Right? Because
Yeah.
that really highlights the culture of a team, and they can't like no one expects you to
Yeah.
ask a question out of the blue, but like that really gives you an idea about you care about the culture of the team that you're going to work with, and you
Right.
want to gauge whether the hiring manager or like the interviewer cares about the role that they're in, like how they handle failure. So that can really, create a thought-provoking
Mm,
conversation, build a connection with your interviewer, and sort of leave them with a lasting impression that this person really cares about what they're doing.
yeah. That's interesting, right? Like you asking the right question to the other person is
Mhm.
one of the ways to really prepare and
Yes.
like do well in the interviews.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Any other tips you want to share, or like this is your secret?
I don't. I wouldn't call it like a secret, but I think
Yeah,
don't be afraid. Like the only tip I can say is don't be afraid of failure because
yeah,
you will constantly improve. You will learn what you did wrong. There is no
yeah,
one secret method of like cracking an interview. I feel
yeah,
it's all about being genuine, being yourself, and finding the right fit between what
yeah.
who you are and what you want to do, and having very good clarity in that, and then looking for roles that sort of can align with you, can align with that thought process, and eventually, I hope that you generally would find what you're looking for.
One question I had was, right. So you were talking
Mm-hmm.
about, hey, let's say certain kinds of question, right? Tell me about a
Mm-hmm.
time where you face this challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at these point of time, like how do you recollect those best stories, right? Like, do you have a
Mm-hmm.
process for it, or you are you a person who writes journal, or like where is that coming from? Because
That's a
some people feel it
mhm.
very like difficult to like actually do it
Mhm.
on the fly, right? Like
Yeah.
remembering that right story or the high impact story, and then
Hmm.
coming up at the point of time where the hiring manager asks you with that right story, that might
Hmm.
find be difficult, right? So what is your methodology there? Yeah. Hmm.
Never touched upon that, but yeah, I think it just became part of my
Yeah.
process of preparation, and that's why I sort of
Yeah.
missed talking about it. But yes, I'm not someone who journals. I am not someone who like sort
Yeah.
of keeps track of everything. But I think what has happened naturally over the years is I've documented or like made a lot of, I don't know, like maybe this is just me, but like I've made a lot of
Yeah.
versions of my resume,
Oh,
and each
okay.
of them has had like sort of a bullet point of what I've done or what projects I've worked
Okay.
on and like highlights of it. So like that's helped
Yeah.
me sort of piece together, even if you're not someone who journals, right? Like that's sort of a like a hidden
That's
journal of
interesting.
sorts where you have these things that you thought were important
Yeah.
at that point of time and you noted them down in your resume and that's what you did. So like luckily I've saved every resume I've ever made into
Yeah.
like a Google Drive folder, and like most of them are horrible by today's standards, but what it helped me sort of unlock is the
Yeah.
situations that I was in, and then sort of craft that story. And I think, yeah, there is a very well known sort of way of talking about things, the star format,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is like the situation,
Uh,
task, achievement, result. Like just
yeah.
tailor your story in that way, right? Like set up the right context. And I think if you remember, I was talking about having the clarity and like being able to like sort of
Yeah.
go to interviews and like judging. This is what sort of this is where the input of those interviews was going, is like crafting the story in a way that the other interviewer who has no zero context
Yeah.
of what the situation is can come
True.
in,
True.
understand, and take away something, right? So the same exact story can maybe be presented in five different ways depending on which person you're talking to and what are they
Yeah.
looking out of that situation. So yeah, just learning how I can craft that story better, making sure that I'm clear about communicating this was the exact problem that I was faced, what didn't work out, what worked out,
Yeah.
what did I learn from it, and how do I adapt to
That's
situations in the
interesting.
future.
Yeah, that's
That's a great question,
interesting,
thank you,
right?
sir.
You don't have a particular mechanism, but your
Hmm.
mechanism is to have like multiple resumes. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, like you can do it different ways, right?
Yeah.
Like, and it's always better to always follow what works
Yes.
for you, right? There is nothing like a fixed system, right?
Hmm.
That's interesting. I think let's
Yeah.
again switch gears. I think we I've been making you talk for a while now, so now I'll give you like till now like we were talking about lengthy, long paragraph questions. So let me give you some rapid
Hmm.
fire questions now, right? Like
Hmm.
in terms of something I wanted like quick
Hmm.
answer from you, like short and crisp, so you don't have to talk for a while.
Yeah.
So yeah, so
Hmm.
we'll get into that, right? This is again like one of my favorite question, right? Like,
Hmm.
so we spoke a lot about our professional stuff and stuff like that, right? Like, how do you improve yourself as a product manager? um, how do you
Hmm.
like daily improve on it, stuff like that, right? Is there anything specific you do for your self
Hmm.
development, right? Like something like, let's say, your productivity, or let's say something related to, like,
Hmm.
people have different definitions of self development, but maybe
Yeah.
like related to your
Hmm.
communication improvement, or um, is there any such things
Hmm.
which you do, like, again, to keep yourself improving daily? Or do you even not separate it out, right? Like, I just want to know your thoughts.
No, that's a great question. I think there are obviously there can be like
Yeah,
a million ways of doing it, but I feel like the two that have worked for me is one, obviously, like sort of expanding your horizon by like as I mentioned, doing things that are not necessarily
yeah,
related to you but interest you,
yeah,
always being curious. But I think the other part is having someone you can sort of have as the
mm,
people who hold you accountable, right? So, like, I think it's very difficult for a person to look at themselves and be like, oh, I did this wrong, right? Whereas having someone you can trust to be like, hey,
mm,
you did this wrong, and that there is
yeah,
maybe some scope for development or improvement here.
yeah,
And not just one person, right? It shouldn't be like, oh, okay, I just want to
yeah,
be better at product management. So I want like a senior product manager to tell me what's
yeah,
wrong, but like just you as a person, right? So like having a maybe an engineering manager or like anyone in your circle, professional circle, not even someone, it could even extend to like beyond your immediate
yeah,
like work circle and be friends who you
mm,
know,
yeah,
your partner, right? Like just including them in the conversation and
yeah,
saying, hey, I did this and I don't think this is the right thing, or
yeah,
like just talk to them about what's happening, and like not obviously don't like talk about stuff you're not supposed to talk about from a company
yeah,
secrets or like whatever perspective, but like just everyday conversations, everyday interactions, and like things that you find
mm,
difficult, and like seek advice and have that circle that you can trust. And I think in Lenny's newsletter, you if you hear one of his podcasts, one of the guests mentioned having like
yeah,
your
yeah,
own
that's an
personal
amazing
board,
concept.
right?
Yeah,
Who you remain accountable to. I think building that up, I never knew that, like,
yeah,
I never called it my board, but like I
yeah,
have
yeah.
people I can sort of rely on. And like now I can call them my board
Yeah, yeah,
members,
it
but
was
like,
a
yeah,
bulb light moment for me
essentially
as
that's
well.
the
Like
best
when
way.
I
Yeah.
heard that concept, because
Mhm.
we never
Yes.
thought of it that way, but it's a very nice coin term. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So like just constantly relying on them and like having that great circle to like hold you accountable, put you in the right direction. I think that's just like the best way to be on the way
awesome,
to self
awesome.
development.
Um, I think
Hmm.
next question I want to ask you is like slightly unrelated, but if you are somebody who love to watch
Hmm.
movies, like, is there any movies that you watch again and again,
Hmm.
learn things from, take inspiration?
I the
Okay.
secret is hidden here. I am someone who is a diehard fan
Oh,
of
okay.
Batman, and like as you can see, there are
Okay.
two Batman
Awesome.
characters on top here. And like another spoiler is like the one movie that I've watched again and again, and I keep going back to, and like somehow it has such relatable quotes that I've kept using their
Yeah.
quotes in like so many situations that I'm embarrassed to admit
Uh-huh.
it. But like Dark Knight by Christopher Nolan has been like
Yeah.
a go-to movie for me because Heath
Yeah.
Ledger has done an amazing job, and yeah, it's
Awesome.
just
Awesome.
overall an amazing
Yeah.
movie.
Like, since you told about quotes, like, are you somebody who likes to keep a lot of quotes in your this thing? Like, you follow quotes, or you love to read quotes?
Uh,
Okay.
Not really. I don't quote a lot, but I think like as I said, right, like just being able to discover and like quote, like
Hmm.
bring knowledge from
Yeah.
one area to
Yeah.
the other. I think that's something that I keep
Interesting.
liking to do.
Interesting. What about
Mhm.
books? Like, do you read books, or love any specific kinds of
Yeah.
books?
That's I think for me one of the good good category of books that I like to read is like
Ah, okay.
biographies. So I've read,
Okay.
as you can see, like
Yeah.
Steve Jobs obviously is like generally a good one, but like there was an interesting one from
Yeah.
the founder of
Amazing.
Nike, Phil Knight, who was again like I think these stories just sort of I know they're like sort of they show everything in like a particular light, but they also help you sort of understand the struggles of how great leaders have done things and like persevered through adversity and gotten to the place that they are and built such great empires. So like for me, that's an interesting sort of point of view of reading stuff. Even the founder of Netflix, his book was pretty good. So yeah, all of that that category of books is what I like to love. But I've never gone back a second time to another
Awesome.
book,
Awesome.
unfortunately.
Cool, Azad. I think with
Mhm.
that, we are mostly coming to the end of the podcast. Thanks a
Mhm.
lot, Azad,
Yeah.
for joining with me. I just want to mention
Mhm.
that Azad is somebody who like helps aspiring product managers as well. He's very active in the community. I would be sharing Azad's Topmate link on the descriptions below. Uh, Azad, do you want to share anything else like to our community and the people who are watching this show?
Yeah, I think nothing much from that perspective. I think we've talked a lot about like just being a good PM and like sort of developing yourself. I feel like the only thing that I've repeated again and again, which is an under theme, which is an undercurrent to all our conversation, is like just keep being curious and like you never know like where it will lead you to. So like don't ever be afraid of saying like no, I don't want to do this or I, like writing a blog post or like doing something that is not an immediate value to me has no learning. Even the most menial of tasks can sometimes lead to something much bigger than you anticipated. So please never say no to anything.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Azad, once again for joining with us and sharing all
Hmm.
your wisdom with us. It was
Hmm.
great talking to you, man.
Hmm.
And I really appreciate you
Hmm.
sharing all those insights you have had over a period of so
Yeah,
much years. And I think like this would definitely help all our
yeah,
viewers, right, in one way or the other. So thanks once again. Um,
I hope so too.
see you. See you.
Yeah, no issues, sir. And like always happy to help.
Bye.
Yeah, bye bye.